Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere will come to order.
Chairwoman, I wanted to ask unanimous consent for Representatives Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida and Barbara Lee of California, both senior members of the Committee on Appropriations, to participate in this hearing after all members have had their chance to question the witnesses.
Thank you for that request. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is more than welcome. Barbara Lee is not.
Can I ask you the reasoning, Chairwoman? The reason I ask...
Oh, I can tell you about the reasoning is because Barbara Lee, who I know is a distinguished member of the Democratic Party, is a friends with the oppressors and not with the Cuban people. Barbara Lee has been friends with Fidel Castro, and there are many statements that we can't repeat, and that indicates that she is just not with the people that I represent, who are the Cuban exile community in Miami.
Sure.
She is not a friend of the Cuban people that we are trying to liberate.
Point of personal privilege, if I could respond really quick. Chairwoman, you know I respect your work, even though our positions on different issues with respect to the Western Hemisphere and Latin America are sometimes far apart. I respected your voice and your work and the policy that you've worked on, but this move to not allow one of our colleagues in the United States Congress, who's been elected by the people she represents, to sit and participate on a panel like this is, I think, unprecedented. And if it's happened before, I don't know about it. And I know that, like many, you have been critical of the government in Cuba in part because it suppresses free speech and suppresses different opinions. And so without getting to the substance of your critique of Congresswoman Lee, Chairwoman, that's exactly what you're doing right now, is you're suppressing somebody from even sitting here and participating in the same way that the Cuban government has suppressed opinion and perspective for decades.
My dear colleague, the Cuban people do not have a platform to express themselves like distinguished lady Barbara Lee or Congresswoman Barbara Lee has had, because she has been able to go to many media outlets. She's been able to express her admiration for Fidel Castro, but this is not the site to do that. She has no position, or she is not welcomed on this committee that I humbly chair. So I thank you very much for your request, but not this time. Therefore, the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere will come.
Entrepreneurs can thrive in Cuba.
The only people who have that heat is the Cuban regime. They could make that happen right now. And unfortunately, you have been friends with those who are not in favor of the Cuban people.
Madam Chair, I am a friend of the United States. I am a member of the United States Congress. I am a friend of the global community. I want to see normal relations between every country in the world and the people of the United States and the government of the United States. we can ensure the values of democracy are promoted as being at the table, engaging.
Fidel Castro has been the worst dictator that the hemisphere has seen since the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. So
Madam Chair, talk about Donald Trump. Motion raised.
Subcommittee, we are
Autocratic.
among other critical bilateral issues. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. And thank you very much to Mr. Jacobstein for coming and for Mr. Roy for being here and wanting to dedicate your time and your expertise to clarify this topic a little bit more. Do you see this poster behind me? What is it? It's a store owned by the Cuban regime. It's a store that sells Gucci's Armani products in the heart of Havana, the most expensive shopping mall in the capital called La Manzana de Gomez. I would like that every MIPYME, as the Cubans call it, which stands for small and medium-sized businesses, to look like this one and be owned by an ordinary Cuban who has nothing to do with the Castro regime. Every Cuban, not just the enchufados, to say it in Spanish, or the children of the Communist Party bosses. And why do I say that? Because so far, unless you have different type of information, based on the info that we have coming from Havana and from Cuba, those who have had an easy path to opening a business like this one are the children of the oppressors or the oppressors themselves. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Ernesto Guevara Jr., the son of Che Guevara. Do we have to say who Che Guevara is? He owns La Poderosa Tours. Number 2, Sandro Castro, the grandson of Fidel, who owns Efe nightclub in Havana. Number 3, Vilma Rodriguez, the granddaughter of Raúl Castro, who owns Casa Vida Luxury Holidays. And 2 members of the Red Avispa, Gerardo Hernandez y René González, who happen to have spent 15 years in a federal prison close to us, are now the main promoters of this new concept, I repeat, called the MIPYMES, small business sector in Cuba, according to the Cubans. Unfortunately, this smells like a new scheme from the regime who is desperate for millions of dollars to violate the American embargo. Remember, they allowed the creation of the MIPYMES in August of 21, just 1 month after the July 11th protests. As you know, the Cuban regime is a master of disguise. And we just saw here right now a little taste of that unfortunately the gentle congresswoman really believes that the Cuban regime is in the business of feeding the Cuban population 3 times a day and giving them prosperity and freedom. I'm so sorry that I have to believe that this is another scheme, and I do want to be wrong. The Biden administration is, according to our information, going to review the new regulations regarding Cuba. The White House has not revealed all the details, although there are rumors that the Biden administration will open the American banking system to this new class of around 9,000 small entrepreneurs who compose this new class of private, independent small business owners. Private, independent small business owners. I repeat, opening the banking system to this supposed new class. There's just a couple of catches to this new initiative. Number 1, the law. The embargo says clearly that all transfers of credit, which means loans, and all payments between banking institutions between Cuba and the United States are forbidden. Number 2, the Biden administration says that the new policy is never going to benefit the regime. But how could that be possible if GAESA, which is this institution that controls all the money that flows in and out of the island, is run by the military? Number 3, the Russians. The Russians are the ones who handle every credit card transaction in the island. So we're talking about 3, the embargo, the regime, and the Russians. But I think that at the end, what we all care to know is that the United States wants to benefit Paco, Berta, Pepito, Fefa, those Cubans who just want to liberate themselves from the joke of the regime. The American administration, I'm sure, does not want to benefit Raúl and his nietos, Miguel y sus hijos, and Ramiro and his primos. I'm going to say a small statement in Spanish. Este es un mensaje para los cubanos. Desde los Estados Unidos, nuestra intención es única y exclusivamente poder ayudar al cubano común de a pie a que pueda liberarse del yugo del régimen. Esa es nuestra intención, ya sea demócrata o republicano. Nosotros lo que queremos es ayudar al cubano común y corriente, pero desgraciadamente siempre hay una artimaña por parte del régimen castrista. Esperemos que esta no sea otra y que los Estados Unidos no ayuden no a los oprimidos, sino a los opresores. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, for any statements he may have.
Thank you. I'm glad to discuss how the United States can support actors in Cuba who are attempting to limit the influence and power of the Cuban authoritarian regime, including the private sector, civil society, and activists. Additionally, welcome to our witnesses from the State Department. It's great to see you again, Mr. Jacobstein, and welcome, Mr. Roy. I stand with the Cuban people in their fight for a government and society that protects human rights, advances democracy, and promotes economic development. I believe that the best way to achieve these goals is through a renewed approach to our engagement with the island, an approach that recognizes that our policies over the last 60 years have not resulted in the changes we would like to see. In some cases, it has even emboldened the Cuban government and strengthened their relationship with key adversaries like China and Russia. The United States can both recognize the threat that the Cuban regime poses to regional national security while also engaging on key priorities and supporting the Cuban people's efforts to further their own democratic aspirations. When we fully take ourselves out of the equation, like what occurred under the quote-unquote maximum pressure policy of the Trump administration, we erase our ability to enact change and support meaningful efforts. And let me be clear, the Cuban government is an authoritarian regime with little respect for human rights or democracy. It ranks near the bottom of every independent measure of democracy. However, historically, we have seen more progress on these issues when we are engaging with the Cuban government, not when we're in complete isolation. Under President Obama, the United States normalized relations by rescinding Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, lifting U.S. travel and remittance restrictions, providing U.S. banks with access to the Cuban financial system, and reopening an embassies in Havana and the Cuban embassy in Washington. President Obama made improving human rights conditions, particularly freedom of expression and assembly, key to a U.S.-Cuba relationship. As he succinctly recognized, our nation's policy towards Cuba is the, quote, last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. And as a test for that, remember, when we think about the argument that we're dealing with a communist country and so forth, China is one of the largest trading partners of the United States. Vietnam is a strong trading partner of the United States, a country with whom we have a strong, prosperous relationship. Unfortunately, the previous administration reversed many of those reforms and implemented even more restrictive policies, including a baseless redesignation of Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list. I was hopeful that the Biden administration would reverse Donald Trump's disastrous policies and set us back on a path towards a normalization with Cuba. I'm grateful that the Biden administration has taken a number of important steps, including providing humanitarian parole and family reunification programs, easing restrictions on remittances, lifting travel restrictions, reopening the Havana embassy and visa and consular services, and renewing funding for Cuban democracy programs. The Biden administration also rightfully condemned the harsh crackdown on July 11th protesters and the subsequent arbitrary imprisonment and punishment of opposition figures, 1,000 of which are estimated to still be in prison today. However, the president's failure to reverse harmful policies like the unwarranted state sponsor of terror designation, sanctions, and the embargo is a serious missed opportunity. The United States policy towards Cuba over the last 60 years has resulted in no tangible proof that these policies move the needle on democratic progress. Instead, they've dramatically worsened the lives of everyday Cubans. Cubans like those who showed up on July 11th begging for policies that support democracy and economic prosperity. The United States is failing those Cubans. Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terror, a last-minute act by former President Trump, does not have any merit and has isolated Cubans from the global financial system, further entrenching the current regime. We must remove Cuba from the SSOT and end this baseless, extremely harmful designation. As President Obama recognized, the embargo on Cuba has not only failed to advance U.S. interests, but has had devastating humanitarian effects by obstructing access to essential goods like food and medicine, exacerbating hunger, undermining the private sector, and eroding critical infrastructure with an even worse impact on women and other minorities. Along with ending the decades-old embargo, the United States could support the Cuban people and their aspirations by waiving Helms-Burton Title III, ending sanctions on shipping companies that provide fuel to Cuba, strengthening agricultural ties, and reviewing entities on Cuba restricted and prohibited accommodations lists. The Cuban embargo and Cuba's presence on the state sponsor of terrorism list are particularly harmful to the growing private sector in Cuba. Contrary to today's hearing title, an independent private sector does exist in Cuba, and supporting this growing private sector presence is both beneficial to the United States and the Cuban people by lessening the reliance on the Cuban government for economic opportunities. The private sector, as of last year, employs 35% of the Cuban workforce and has provided food and other essential goods to the island, which are normally inaccessible. We should be supporting these entrepreneurial efforts, not stifling them. Yet our current policies prevent the private sector from accessing bank accounts, obtaining key investments, and inhibit growth due to overcompliance. We need the Cuban people to have independence from the Cuban regime. This is how. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the United States is supporting this crucial part of Cuban society while also advancing our mutual goals of democracy, human rights, and economic development. With that, I yield back to our chair.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. And now other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And today we have a panel of witnesses from the State Department who work closely with the issues surrounding the bilateral relationship between the United States and Cuba. Mr. Eric Jacobstein is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs and the United States Department of State. And Mr. Enrique Roig is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the Department of State. And thank you for being here today once again. For your full statements will be made part of the record, and I will ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to around 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Jacobstein for his opening statement. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Biden-Harris administration's support for the Cuban people, including through encouraging the growth of the independent private sector. I plan to share our observations on the evolution in Cuba's economy and private sector, discuss deep concerns we have about the Cuban government's ongoing abuse of human rights, and our corresponding efforts to maximize support for the Cuban people while minimizing benefit for the Cuban government. The Cuban economy is in dire straits. Amid recurring shortages of fuel, electricity, and increasingly even food, it is clear that the communist experiment in Cuba has failed, and the government is not able to provide for its citizens' most basic needs. In a country where there are no free elections, the Cuban people are voting with their feet. Roughly 500,000 Cubans migrated to the United States in the last 2 fiscal years, using both lawful pathways and dangerous irregular migration routes, with tens of thousands more leaving for other countries. In May 2022, our administration announced policy measures focused on empowering the Cuban people, including support for Cuba's private sector. And these changes are in our national security interest, and they're consistent with President Biden's guidance to benefit the Cuban people while continuing to deny resources to the Cuban regime. Against this backdrop, we've seen the Cuban government grudgingly open space to a nascent, yet growing private sector. While cuentapropistas, or self-employed proprietors, have been illegal for some years, in 2021, the Cuban government also legalized the creation of small and medium-sized enterprises. With over 10,000 private businesses registered, operating in diverse fields, from food distribution to construction to auto repair, Cuba's private sector is now responsible for nearly 1/3 of all employment on the island. And these changes have profoundly affected Cuban culture. Young Cubans are eager to earn private sector wages rather than work for the state. A class of independent business leaders is emerging. I know this because our team, both in Havana and in Washington, routinely meets with these individuals. And I had the chance to meet with a group of them just this week virtually. Despite enormous challenges, these individuals report feeling energized by the prospect of no longer relying on the government and instead shaping their own economic destiny. These entrepreneurs look to the United States for inspiration and to develop the necessary skills to run successful businesses. To that end, the State Department has supported programs that help to foster essential skills and know-how among independent Cuban entrepreneurs. In an acute twist of irony, the island's communist government must now rely on a private enterprise to provide food and basic services for its people. It is not an easy road for these entrepreneurs. The Cuban government's mismanagement of its economy has led to unparalleled high inflation. But because it is more nimble and efficient than the government, the private sector currently serves as a life preserver for the Cuban people, without which they could not stay afloat. We believe the organic expansion of the Cuban private sector on the island, led by the Cuban people themselves and not by any foreign government, is an opportunity that should not be wasted. Above all, we must encourage the freedom of Cuban citizens to define their own economic future. Failing to engage and support Cuba's private sector will leave space for Russia and the PRC to shape the direction of the Cuban economy. We must not allow this to happen. Cuban entrepreneurs prefer U.S. values and our economic model and see the United States as their business partner of choice. And we are focused on taking measures that inject a real sense of hope among the Cuban people and stem the tide of worsening humanitarian and migration conditions, all while remaining steadfast in promoting accountability for the Cuban government's continued abuses. Now, I want to close by noting the promotion of private enterprise is just one part of U.S. engagement in Cuba. We consistently advocate for Cubans' fundamental freedoms and press for the release of unjustly detained political prisoners. In our conversations with entrepreneurs and the Cuban government, we emphasize the importance of respecting labor rights of Cuban entrepreneurs and all Cuban workers. We facilitated the resumption and expansion of remittances and flights between the United States and cities outside Havana, and we've expanded access to safe and lawful migration pathways in support of Cuban American families. Our embassy in Havana resumed full immigrant visa processing, and the Department of Homeland Security implemented a modernized process for the Cuban Family Reunification Program. We increased tourist visa validity, which brought immediate tangible benefits to Cubans visiting family and purchasing goods in the United States. In sum, our approach continues to support everyday Cubans while promoting accountability for the Cuban government's abuses. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobstein. And now I now recognize Mr. Roig for his opening statement.
Thank you. Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on our efforts to support human rights in Cuba, a key Biden-Harris administration priority. Unfortunately, the human rights situation in Cuba remains abysmal. The repressive environment, combined with a disastrous economy, has prompted a mass exodus from the island, including of youth activists and human rights defenders. The efforts of the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor to promote human rights in Cuba includes over $6 million in foreign assistance programs annually. Our initiatives incorporate human rights documentation and advocacy, including those related to freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression. We also support documentation of labor rights violations and advocacy targeting international labor bodies and labor union confederations. Our implementers strengthen fact-based reporting and the professionalism of independent media, and our efforts have increased access to information, including by assisting in circumventing internet censorship on island. Recently, I met with a range of civil society actors in Miami who are deeply engaged on many issues relating to Cuba. Two issues came up repeatedly, which I know are of concern to the subcommittee. First, the plight of unjustly detained political prisoners, and second, Cuban workers, including medical professionals, who may be the victims of human trafficking and exploitation through Cuba's labor export program. I would therefore like to discuss each of these topics in greater detail. Civil society estimates that there are approximately 1,000 unjustly detained political prisoners in Cuba. Reports describe how they are subjected to mistreatment, including where it involves isolation, denial of visits by family members, and lack of access to health care. Political prisoners have also reported that fellow inmates acting on orders from or with the permission of prison authorities beat, threatened, intimidated, and harassed them. To call attention to their plight, many political prisoners have engaged in hunger strikes. Our campaign to free unjustly detained political prisoners without just cause highlighted two Cuban prisoners, Michael Sorbo Castillo and Jose Daniel Ferrer. Unfortunately, they remain behind bars, so we continue to advocate bilaterally for their release. We also highlight the political prisoner problem in multilateral contexts. For example, Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs Brian Nichols and I participated in a September 19th roundtable on the margins of the UN General Assembly that shed light on the plight of unjustly detained political prisoners. And also our department programming supports civil society-led advocacy in international fora. For example, under a department program, details on nearly 1,000 individual cases of human rights violations were submitted to international human rights bodies. Programs support groups to engage with the UN Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions, and the Special Rapporteur on Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, among others. The department also supported organizations who drafted and submitted shadow reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council for the 2023 Cuba Universal Periodic Review. The reports covered political prisoners, politically and religiously motivated repression, torture, gender-based violence, sedition cases, and labor rights. And to promote further accountability, in July 2022, the department took steps to impose visa restrictions on 28 Cuban officials who had enabled unjust detentions and sham trials of hundreds of peaceful protesters who are now political prisoners. Let me now turn to the issue of trafficking in persons. Cuba's labor export program, which includes medical missions, is particularly concerning. Through this program, the Cuban government sends tens of thousands of workers around the globe under multi-year cooperative agreements negotiated with receiving countries. Workers have reported having their passports confiscated and their movements restricted by the Cuban government. They work long hours, often under dangerous or degrading conditions, and are surveyed, threatened, and in some cases even sexually harassed. Workers reportedly receive only 5 to 25% of their salary, with salaries retained in bank accounts they do not fully control and seized by the Cuban government if they leave the program. Exploitation of the workers in the labor export program includes banning those who flee it from returning to Cuba for up to 8 years. And so to confront this degrading practice, the department has increased bilateral engagement with countries hosting Cuban workers to promote awareness of Cuba's exploitative practices and urge countries to uphold their international obligations, follow best labor and human rights practices, and protect trafficking victims. The Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons has prioritized this issue. And in September, its ambassador, Cindy Dyer, traveled to Miami to engage with civil society actors and hear directly from survivors. So as you can see, Chairwoman and members of the subcommittee, we take the issue of human rights in Cuba very seriously, and we look to address it at every turn. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions and to working closely with the committee in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roig. Very well said. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'm very happy that the State Department recognizes the human trafficking of doctors, something despicable. I mean, you cannot leave with your wife or with your kids. You only make 5% of whatever that country pays to the regime. And if you want to access the rest of the money, you can't until you go back to Cuba. That's called slavery. So thank you for bringing that up. And to you, Mr. Jacobstein, thank you once again for being here. We had the opportunity to talk to each other, so I'm very happy that we're going to be able to speak again. First and foremost, I just want to highlight that you and I were on the same page. We want the same thing. I'm the first one who wants to be convinced that in a totalitarian regime, as I said to the gentle Congresswoman from California, the Cuban Revolution is probably the most cruel and the most repressive revolution that the Western Hemisphere has seen since the arrival of Christopher Columbus. That was many years ago. That was in 1498, 92. We're talking about people who have brought repression to scientific levels, where the invincibility of the regime is in the heart of the average Cuban. That's why they would rather catch a raft, meet the sharks in the Strait of Florida, and reach the city that I represent, the city of Havana. So we're talking about people who are completely different. We're talking to Hamas. They're the Hamas of the hemisphere. Now you are telling me that there is this flourishing small and middle size businesses who are independent from the regime, totalitarian regime, has controlled for 62 years every single aspect of the Cuban population. Now you're telling me that this phenomenon is occurring, and that you and I will want to help them, of course. And I would love for you to convince not only me, but the Cuban exile community that I represent, that this is true. And I'm sure that you were going to be able to hear different reasons why, according to your statement, this is really happening. But the first question is the Biden administration planning to give the called MIPYMES access to the United States banking sector? Yes or no?
Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. As you know, in May 2022, we announced a series of measures to support the Cuban people, and one of those, measures, the majority have been implemented, including remittances, including a number of the issues I spoke to already. In terms of the private sector, we've not yet implemented those regulations, and we'll provide further information.
But are you thinking about, because opening the American banking sector, those are major words, because we're talking about then providing loans to those supposedly small business owners. Are you planning to open the American banking sector to the Cuban MIPYMES, as they call them?
Thank you, ma'am. I don't have further information on specific regulatory changes at this time.
Okay. Make sure that you send the word back to the State Department that is not going to be a very good idea, because number one, that violates the United States embargo, which happens to be codified in the United States Congress, as I'm sure you know. Now, let's go back to—
Any actions we take would be done under
please,
the law.
Yes, that's exactly what I want to hear, that whatever measures or regulations you're trying to implement are going to follow the United States law, meaning the United States embargo, or the United States embargo against the island of Cuba. Unfortunately, because the real embargo is against the regime, the regime has it against its own people. Because you and I agree that if tomorrow morning the Cuban regime decides to lift the embargo that they have on the Cuban people, we would be very close friends, right? Don't you agree?
I would always be happy to be a very close friend of yours.
No, not of me, of the Cuban people. Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure about me, but I'm irrelevant. The United States would be a very close friend of the Cuban people if the Cuban regime decides tomorrow morning to lift the embargo they have on their people.
Absolutely. We've continually focused on holding the regime accountable and supporting the Cuban people. That's our focus.
Okay, so then now with the MIPYMES, how do you know that these are not just fronts, or most of them? We're talking about 9,000 of them. Supposedly they're hiring 250,000 people, Cubans. How do you know that this is not a facade?
Thank you, ma'am. I know there's been much debate in the press and social media about the true measure of independence of Cuba's private sector. Our assessment is that there's a range of actors working in the Cuban economy. And some would like to speak in absolutes here. We don't think it's about absolutes, that either the Cuban economy is completely free and independent, or it is still 100% dominated by the government of Cuba and its cronies. Our embassy's assessment speaks to a more nuanced approach here, and our approach, therefore, must be more nuanced as well. And
so what you're trying to tell me is that you're willing, as long as you're helping some Cubans who have some independence from the regime, it's inevitable that you would have to help some of the kids of the dirigentes.
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, so then what are you saying?
I spoke with Cuban independent entrepreneurs this week. I've many times in the past. These are people who are as far as possible from the Cuban regime. These are individuals suffering under the economic mismanagement of the regime. These are individuals who are making very tough economic choices. They told me, you don't understand. As a private sector, we have it worse here in Cuba than any private sector in the world. They're struggling because of economic mismanagement. And so,
I hear it, but once again, I say that's in the hands of the regime. They could lessen those hardships in a minute. Now, let me just give you an example. I called a friend that I have in Havana, and she said, look, La Panadería La Antilla, that is in Calzado del Cerro 1571, used to belong or provide pan, bread, to El Ministerio del Interior. They closed, and 2 weeks after, they reopened as a MIPYME, right there. Then how can you make sure that you're not going to be helping those people who are the oppressors? Because I'm sure you don't want to be helping the oppressors, or you want to be help the oppressed. Tell me.
thank you. Our embassy staff in Havana regularly engages with entrepreneurs and often visits their place of business. And they hold ongoing conversations with these individuals. So any derogatory information received on an entrepreneur is reviewed carefully and shared as appropriate within the interagency. We'd welcome any information you'd like to share with us.
And I'm sure that I'm going to be feeding you a lot of it. Now, the imports, you know that there's something called GAESA, which is this institution, it belongs to the military, that controls every money that flows in and out of Cuba. So how is the Biden administration going to help just the Cuban people without going through GAESA, which is the one that controls the flows of dollars? How do you do that?
Thank you. This is a complicated situation. It's very tough, and we don't speak in absolutes here. We need nuance if we really want to focus on...
Speak nuanced means that you do have to be sleeping with the devil. Is that what you're telling me? Speaking nuanced.
No, I think it means that if we're supporting the Cuban people, we have to work within the system that exists. This is difficult. We wish it didn't. As I said, the private sector is suffering. They admit that, and we're looking for all means possible to support that Cuban sector as the humanitarian crisis on the island deepens and as outmigration continues.
Unfortunately, you have to deal with the regime, and you know it. Now, there's another one called Guajirito that has $15 million in exports. Could you imagine a regular Cuban having $15 million in exports? Wow, that's great. Who is Guajirito? I mean, who do you think they are? Because they are being showcased by the Cuban regime. You think that the average Cuban could have an enterprise that exports $50 million?
Absolutely not. And these businesses tend to be extremely small.
Okay. All right, tell me.
Yeah, ma'am, these businesses tend to be extremely small, suffering. These are individuals who told me...
The real ones, you mean? The ones that are not enchufados with the regime.
Yeah, the independent entrepreneurs are about 1/3 of the economy, 10,000 small, medium-sized enterprises.
Right. I will just ask you one more question, and then I will recognize my fellow members of the subcommittee. On November 20th of 2023, the United States Embassy in Havana hosted a concert for hip-hop artist who happens to be a convicted felon called Big Fredia. And on June, you showed a movie, Changing the Game, which is about biological men competing in women's sports. What does that have to do with advancing the freedom in Cuba?
So the U.S. Embassy in Havana, through our public diplomacy section, we engage in a wide range of activities to advance U.S. foreign policy goals in Cuba, including respect for human rights. So events that focus on the human rights of individuals belong to often marginalized communities, as Big Fredia, a member of the African-American community, LGBT community, such as the program with her, help us to engage wider and younger audiences. And during her visit, Big Fredia drew on the popularity of her music and performances to engage in a wide range of discussions with the LGBTQ plus population, with the Afro-Cuban population, and shared history on the importance of Black cultural influence in music.
Mr. Jacobstein, I believe that maybe the average Cuban who loves and adores the United States would like to be receiving something different, maybe something a little bit more edifying, more gratifying from the United States Embassy. I'm not saying that these are not important topics, but for the average Cuban who's suffering exactly what you guys guys just told me is just maybe we should send word to the embassy that maybe the Cubans will want to see something else coming from the United States. Now I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Well, I want to say I support the proposed reforms, and I hope that they ultimately get implemented. I think it would represent progress. I think we probably all agree that we want to see Cuba change. The question is, how does that happen? Does it happen with the same isolationist, arm's length policy that we've pursued for the last 60 years that has made Cuba weaker, poorer, that has thrown it into the arms of Russia and China? Or does it help through engagement? Now, the private sector in Cuba is made up not just, there may be some folks who are fronts for the government, but it's my understanding that a lot of these folks are regular Cubans. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Can you tell us how the private sector is benefiting the Cuban people? Not the government, but the Cuban people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I had a good opportunity to speak with a number of these individuals just this week. And these are cafe and restaurant owners, event producers, individuals who are having a really hard time importing goods. So these are individuals who make no money from the state economy, who cannot survive. And this new way of business, 30% of the Cuban economy, this is really the future. And frankly, this is capitalism, and this is what we want in Cuba. So when we're doing work, training individuals, whether it's on marketing, labor rights, or otherwise, these are skills on capitalism. That's precisely what we need for these individuals who are really struggling.
This is the creation of a market-based economy, the beginnings of it at least.
Precisely.
And even, I know Chairwoman Salazar made the point about government fronts, but let's just assume that all of these businesses were run by somebody in the government or some agency. It would still represent a kind of transformation to a market-based economy, at least more than what you've seen right now. So even in the worst case scenario where all of it was run by the government, it is a new kind of market-based economy. I don't believe that's the case. Nothing I've seen or heard convinces me that that's the case. But it represents the Cuban government implicitly, the communist Cuban government, implicitly admitting that they have to do something different than they've done for decades. And so that is a positive thing for us. The current situation is also dangerous for the Cuban people and for the United States and for Latin America because it has caused hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee Cuba and make the dangerous trek to the United States. We speak often about addressing the challenges of migration, and we talk about, well, we're going to put this many border patrol, and we're going to put more surveillance, and and there's going to be a bigger section of the wall in Texas. The longer-term solution is to help build up the economies of these places and the safety of these places that people are fleeing. And so the private sector growing in Cuba, to me, represents one promising aspect of what's going on in the countries where people are fleeing in Latin America. I wanted to ask you a question about the embargo. These efforts to increase access to financial services, as I said, are welcome, but I feel like we're ignoring the elephant in the room. If the goal is to help the Cuban private sector, the 60-year embargo of Cuba, I believe, must end. So I wanted to ask you, does the administration continue to support the embargo? And if so, does the State Department have evidence to show that the embargo has accomplished its purpose?
Thank you, sir. We do not have any comment in terms of actions that Congress would have to take with regard to the embargo, but certainly understand your perspective on this, and anything that we do in terms of reforms would be done under U.S. law.
Now, a question on migration. Since 2021, 3% of Cubans have fled their country, the majority to the United States. In response, the Biden administration has expanded lawful pathways for Cubans to migrate to the United States, including through access to humanitarian parole and family reunification programs. How vital is the President's parole authority in helping manage migration from Cuba?
Thank you for that question. And you're absolutely right. This administration has expanded lawful pathways in a way that has not been done in decades. And we've created lawful pathways for these individuals seeking entry in the United States, including through the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela parole program and the Cuba Family Reunification Parole Program. And with CHNV, the program I mentioned first, 68,000 Cubans have been able to have a legal pathway to the United States as of January 11th of this year under that program over the past year. So this has been a vital pathway, as has the CFRP.
Thank you. yield back.
Have a little more.
That's fine. I know, I want the other members to be able to.
All right.
ask
And
a
now I yield and I recognize Mr. Green from the state of Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for appearing here today. When I see patients as a physician, it's my first duty to make the proper diagnosis. Once I understand the cause of the medical problem, then I can come up with a medical plan. The nature of the problem determines the nature of the solution. If you misdiagnose the problem, your solution is going to be wrong, or maybe even worse. There's no doubt that there's a crisis in Cuba. The country is impoverished, it's ruled by a tyrannical and corrupt regime, its people are forced to endure egregious violations of human rights, and political prisoners are detained, tortured, and killed. Everyone can agree on this. The million-dollar question, however, is who's at fault? The far left claim that this is a result of the U.S. embargo on the country, and that the Trump-era policy of maximum pressure on the Cuban people is to blame. But those making these wild assertions fail to ask why these policies were implemented in the first place. Cuba has suffered under a communist rule for 60 years, with a vast majority of the economy owned or controlled by the regime. Now more than ever, the Cuban regime is brutally repressing and punishing its civil society and violating the basic human rights of its citizens. Activists, protesters, and even bystanders are unjustly imprisoned and subject to torture and inhumane treatment that the Cuban regime dispenses upon its dissidents. The regime even engages in state-sponsored human trafficking, enriching itself off the profits of forced labor. Cuba is not impoverished because the United States refuses to do business with them. Russia, China, Venezuela, and several other less than reputable countries happily conduct business with the Cuban regime. Rather, the country is impoverished because the regime, at every turn, enriches itself at the people's expense, and they viciously beat down anyone who questions their policies. That is communism, plain and simple, whether it's the former Soviet Union, the CCP, or the Cuban regime. Opening the United States to Cuba will not enrich the country. The corrupt government will not spontaneously root out corruption and redistribute the wealth back to the people. It will not release the thousands of political prisoners it is locked up, and it will certainly not embrace the free market principles required to do business with the United States. The Cuban military is embedded in nearly every single business, so the concept of a private sector is virtually non-existent in the country. The only outcome to the Biden administration easing pressure off the country is that the brutal Cuban regime will further gorge itself on the profits provided by American businesses, and we will be complicit. The Cuban government, through its military, is metastasizing throughout Latin America. Anything that puts another dollar into the hands of the Cuban government will increase the export of that authoritarianism. Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, et cetera, et cetera. Doing so, putting money into the hands of this authoritarian regime, is almost as stupid as easing sanctions on Iran or trading $6 billion for 5 hostages. Now is not the time for us to ease up. Now is the time for the United States to hold strong in its steadfast commitment to ensure that the Western Hemisphere is truly free and prosperous. This administration's ceaseless flirting with opening ties to Cuba will remove the only chance that the Cuban citizens have for freedom. It is no small thing for the Cuban regime to endure an embargo from the United States, even with China and Russia as economic partners. If we remove the only leverage that we have to push for reform, then the Cuban regime will have no reason to treat its people with dignity and respect. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield.
Thank you, Congressman Green. Now I recognize Congressman Mr. Moskowitz from the state of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I share many similarities with the positions that the Chairwoman has stated today and in the past. And I do think whilst all the situations are obviously different, I do think there are similarities in Iran and North Korea and Cuba and what's happening in Gaza. Yes, in all of those situations, we support the Cuban people, we support the Iranian people, we support the people of North Korea, we support people who are oppressed everywhere. But the United States has to have policies against those regimes. Of course, when you have opportunities to try to pivot and make progress, we should take advantage of those in all instances. But I'm not convinced that the Cuban regime has afforded those opportunities. I just don't think we're there. And so, look, we got to do everything we can to lessen humanitarian crisis in Cuba, just like we have to try to lessen the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But that doesn't mean that we should change our policies with the dictators and the totalitarian regimes that control these areas. And so, I agree with a lot of my colleagues across the aisle here on their policies, but I would remind them to talk to their colleagues that don't necessarily serve on foreign affairs, but to talk to their Republican colleagues that are in the House and don't want to help give Ukraine money. Because it's the very same logic here with what Russia is doing in Ukraine and the totalitarian regime that Putin is in Russia. And so these are all, different sides of the coin, but they share similarities. And so while we should be strong and unified where we can when it comes to Cuba, I ask my colleagues on this committee and on foreign affairs to talk to their Republican colleagues right now that are holding up support for money for Ukraine. Now, I want to talk about China, and I want to get to a couple questions. Mr. Jacobson, this is for you. So, many of my colleagues on the Democratic side, the Republican side, share concerns about China's growing influence. It's why we set up the China Select Committee. We're seeing everywhere, and I saw this on my trip with Speaker McCarthy when we went around the globe. Everywhere the United States creating a vacuum, China is filling it. Right? Which is why the isolationist policies, again, of some of my colleagues are so dangerous, because as we retract, China comes in. We're seeing their influence in Latin America and Africa and the Caribbean. Last summer, Secretary Blinken expressed his deep concerns about China's efforts and increased intelligence and military activities in Cuba. In this time, some of those concerns have been expressed. What is your assessment of China's economic, diplomatic, and military presence in Cuba?
Thank you, Congressman. So we've advised Cuba on several levels that it's not in its interest to collaborate with the PRC on problematic activity. PRC assistance incurs long-term and non-transparent steep costs for countries globally, and Cuba is no different. You mentioned the comments that Secretary Blinken made in his June 20th statement on monitoring this closely and protecting our homeland and our interests here. We assess that our diplomatic outreach on this topic has slowed down the PRC's efforts to project and sustain its military power in Cuba and around the world. And we'll continue to use all potential tools in the administration's toolkit, including targeted sanctions, as appropriate to address these challenges. We remain confident that we can meet all of our security commitments at home and in the region. And I would note that efforts like supporting the Cuban private sector are precisely the kind of things that we can do to curb further Chinese influence. We want to be the ones in there influencing the private sector rather than the PRC or Russia.
In your opinion, how, or if at all, has U.S. adversaries, in addition to China, sought to take advantage of Cuba's economic situation to pursue maybe their own strategic priorities? We see China doing that, if you want to elaborate, obviously, but who else in addition? Russia, obviously.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. Russia's obviously another key example, and we remain concerned about Russia's activities in Cuba, and we continue to take steps to counter it. And Russia and Cuba, they frequently announce increased ties or trade deals. We seldom see much follow-through from the Russian government, which is no surprise. But we know that Russia wants a more stable authoritarian regime. And it's important for us that we not cede space to Russia in the development of Cuba's nascent private sector. So that's why we feel like our engagement in this space is important. And to us, it remains the best way to counter Russia's malign economic influence.
And just in a hypothetical, just so we can kind of, pique our interest. I mean, is there any evidence that if the United States were to change its posture at all, that the regime would turn away from China and Russia? I haven't seen it. I'm just curious if you have.
I certainly think when we're dealing with these independent entrepreneurs, they would benefit more from us, from the United States government, than from PRC and Russia officials. So I think that would be one key example where we can have influence.
Yeah, because I heard that as I travel the globe, that everyone would much rather do business with us than China or Russia. But I also don't see them retracting from China and Russia and the deals that they are making. And I'm seeing that from not just some of the countries I named earlier, even in Europe, quite frankly, with the deal we saw that Italy made. they're not getting out of that deal so quickly. So it's deeply concerning. I'll just wrap up with this. I just want to make a suggestion to the majority. Listen, there are vast differences that we have, whether it's on this issue or other foreign policy issues. Lord knows I have differences with my folks in my own party, like when it comes to Israel. But I think we should always allow members, when they try to wave on to committee, even when we disagree and we think they're wrong, we should always allow them to make their point and then beat them in the debate and point out why they're wrong. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would like now to yield, to recognize Congressman Self from the state of Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, on immigration, our immigration issues are the Biden policies. And parole that you are so proud of, parole abuse, is one of the major issues with our immigration problem, our illegal immigration problem. So let's don't kid ourselves that it has to do only with the Cuban state of the economy. The new deputy for the Border Patrol said if we simply instituted one policy, remain in Mexico, we would cut down illegal immigration by 65 to 70%. Secondly, I wish the Biden administration took the issue of human rights in America as seriously as you are saying he takes them in Cuba. Cuba, as we know, has over 1,000 people facing up to 25-year prison sentences. 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba today. Today, we have hundreds in a D.C. jail without conviction and being denied their constitutional right to a speedy trial. But I want to focus on one. In 2022, 20 armed FBI agents showed up at this man's house at dawn and arrested him under the FACE Act, saying that he had pushed a man outside of a pro-life clinic. Pro-abortion clinic. He was thankfully acquitted, but that's the Biden administration's modus operandi. And when I get told, well, we may have a few bad apples at the top of the FBI, believe you me, Chris Wray was not in one of those vehicles. He was not one of those 20 agents that showed up at that man's house. And while I'm on the topic of abortion, I want to say that we have the great shame to be one of 7 countries in the world that allow abortion past 20 weeks. We share that distinction with countries such as China, North Korea, Singapore, Vietnam. We have 27 states that have that standard or worse. So I don't find your testimony very credible, but I hope that you would find credible The Economist, which I understand that you appreciate. As little as 2 weeks ago, The Economist, not exactly a rag, has said that Cuba's economy is in its worst state since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Why would this not be the time to force regime change? I will tell you that political loyalty, according to The Economist, is still the factor in allowing any business to run. And The Economist says that small tweaks to a rotten system will not be enough to stem Cuba's decline. We've said in enough hearings with the State Department here in the Foreign Affairs Committee to know that soft power doesn't stand up to the Chinese strong power, hard power, their stronger power that they're using in the global South as a whole very well. So I leave it at that. I don't find this human rights discussion very meaningful. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Congressman Self of Texas. Now I will recognize Congresswoman Kim Lager-Dove from the state of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I guess I just want to welcome everybody to the Twilight Zone. First, I just have to say that Barbara Lee is not a pawn or a puppet or part of a scheme of Cuba. She is a black woman who was just silenced denied her voice that she was rightfully elected to have. And I just have to say that that was shameful to watch as a woman of color, to see another woman of color silence another woman of color in front of a room with a large number of women. And I hope that that is a practice that we do not continue. I'd also just like to say that I don't understand the arguments that suggest you can economically repress a country and expect them to do something other than the few options that are available to them. You know, if Russia is handling all of Cuba's financial transactions, well then, you know what? By not engaging with them in a substantive, real, thoughtful way, we are in fact helping Russia to try to defeat Ukraine, especially when we are not supporting Ukraine, and we are contributing to the sanctions, and we are not taking Cuba off of SSOT. So it would be great if we could not talk in circularity and just have real honest discussions, understanding when we compartmentalize and when we don't, because the reality is we have allies with countries all over the globe where we do not agree with every single action, behavior, or policy that they take. So to then practice purity with Cuba boggles my mind. U.S. policy toward Cuba seems perpetually stuck in the Cold War, held hostage by those who are still in their feelings and who seemingly want to cripple the country entirely with little regard for whether it advances U.S. interests or increases the suffering of the Cuban people. And the latest manifestation of this is a conspiracy theory about the dangers of a budding Cuban private sector that is clearly improving Cubans' quality of life and enabling people to reduce their dependence on a repressive regime. One I have seen, because I've been to Cuba, and I have visited the small businesses, and I have talked to folks in the private sector who want more of it because it keeps them from having to be solely reliant on a government that cannot provide all of the needs it has declared itself to be able to do. It is counterproductive. And I'm also disappointed in the Biden administration's inaction when it comes to reversing or meaningfully modifying 60 years of ineffective and counterproductive policy. Cuba is not a panacea. No place is. But in my mind, it doesn't meet the statutory definition of a state sponsor of terrorism, a designation that was arbitrarily reimposed in the final days of the Trump administration. I'm trying to think the last time I heard of a Cuban terrorist killing hundreds of people, taking thousands hostage, shelling missiles all over the place. I will need help coming up with those names. So Assistant Secretary Jacobstein, since you've been talking so much here in front of us, what is the administration's justification for Cuba's SSOT designation?
Thank you, Congresswoman. U.S. law establishes specific statutory criteria for rescinding a state-sponsored terrorism designation. Any future review of Cuba's status, should one occur, would be based on the law and criteria established by Congress.
Yeah, so why are they still on the list?
So we note that the state-sponsored terrorism designation remains a specific tool to address governments of countries that repeatedly provide support for acts of international terrorism. Other tools exist to address non-terrorism concerns related to Cuba, but at any future...
I know you're in a pickle. I know you're in a pickle. I'm in a pickle here, sitting here. Do you think that Cuba poses a threat similar to Iran, North Korea, or Syria?
I would just note again that any future review of Cuba's status, should one happen, would be based on the law and criteria established by Congress.
So if they were taken off the list, would you say that there are other tools available to hold the Cuban regime accountable?
There absolutely are other tools to hold the Cuban regime accountable.
Yes, and do we try to use those?
Yes, I mean, Cuba is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, so there's plenty of tools and also additional sanctions, such as the global Magnitsky sanctions that my colleague, Deputy Assistant Secretary Roy, spoke to following the July 11, 2021 protests.
You're lucky my time is up. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Now I recognize Mr. Stanton from the state of Arizona.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As a matter of professional courtesy to our colleague, Representative Barbara Lee, who was not able to wave onto this committee, I wanted to take this opportunity to read the statement for the record that she would have made if she had been here to appear and present the information that she wanted to present to this committee. So this is a statement for the record by the Honorable Barbara Lee of California. I want to thank my friend, Ranking Member Joaquin Castro, for inviting me to participate in this hearing. I'm outraged that Chair Salazar has taken the unprecedented step of objecting to me participating in this discussion. I've been working on United States policy towards Cuba for 4 decades, since I was a staffer for the late, great Ron Dellums, and I believe I have something valuable to contribute to this conversation. One thing that I hope we can all agree on here is that the United States should support the efforts of the Cuban people to build a peaceful and prosperous society, one that can meet the hopes and needs of the Cuban people. We see the Cuban people organizing in the political space, the cultural space, and even the economic space. The Cuban people want to build a freer society, but the United States policy is based on the idea that if we punish them just a little more, we will make them succeed. We see the failure of this upside-down policy everywhere. More Cubans are fleeing the island than ever before, adding to the humanitarian crisis. Do we really want to exacerbate a situation where life in Cuba is so unbearable that people will risk their lives to leave? Do we want the best and brightest, the Cubans most likely to inspire change in Cuba, to flee? In Cuba today, we see a flowering of entrepreneurship unlike any we've seen before. Cuban government officials themselves are nervous about this independent economic activity, and so far, the response of too many people in Washington has been to try to make those entrepreneurs' lives harder. Does that make any sense? After 6 decades of failure, it is long past time for the United States to try something different. The Obama administration's effort to engage Cuba offered real hope that the Cuban people might have the chance to finally determine their own destiny, free from the meddling of either the United States or Cuban governments, while politicians in Washington and Havana continue their petty squabbles. It is the Cuban people who are paying the price. I hope this hearing can be the start of us all working together to create a smarter, more humane U.S. policy towards Cuba. That's a statement of our colleague and friend, Representative Barbara Lee. Now, on my own behalf, I want to say thank you to Madam Chair and Ranking Member Castro for holding this hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. And I want to say something about my friend, the former Senator of Arizona, Jeff Flake. Arizona's esteemed former Senator Jeff Flake was an outspoken advocate for normalizing relations with Cuba. During his time in Congress, he was among the American officials to finally bring American Alan Gross home after 5 long years in a Cuban prison. He worked across the aisle and with the Obama administration to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba after half a century. And he founded the bipartisan Cuba Working Group to push for fewer punitive economic restrictions, which are scapegoated by the Cuban government to cover its own failures. Senator Flake believed it's long past time we moved on from the conflicts of the past, that doing so not only furthered our shared goal of a free and democratic Cuba, it serves American interests, and he emphasized, quote, "These aren't just sanctions on Cubans, they are sanctions on Americans." And that's why we are here today. Record numbers of migrants from all over the world have been apprehended along the border in my home state of Arizona, including an unprecedented number of Cubans. Not only are Cuban migrants making the dangerous 90-mile trip to the U.S. by sea, many are now making an even longer journey through Latin America to the U.S.-Mexico border, driven by fears of persecution and economic desperation. In fact, since 2022, 4% of Cuba's population has migrated to the U.S.-Mexico border. Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein, the Biden administration has expanded lawful pathways for Cubans to migrate to the United States, including through humanitarian patrol and family unification programs. We've also started bilateral talks on migration. How has this engagement resulted in better U.S.-Cuba cooperation on undocumented migration?
Thank you, Congressman. We have indeed worked to expand access to safe and lawful immigration pathways. In January 2023, as I noted, we announced the CHNV program, which has expanded opportunities for Cubans, and it was essential to include Cubans, many of whom are fleeing the humanitarian crisis, and so those individuals can lawfully come to the United States. The U.S. Embassy in Havana also resumed full immigrant visa processing in January of 2023, and the Department of Homeland Security resumed processing cases under the Cuban Family Reunification Program in Havana in August 2022, and implemented a modernized program in August 2023. So all of this is critical. I led the delegation, the U.S. delegation, to the migration talks in Havana in November, which is important. This is an island that's 90 miles away from us. We need to be in continual contact on issues that are in our interest, and managing migration is in our national security interest.
Thank you very much for that answer. I hope that when the Democrats are in majority, we hope next year, that a policy about offering the opportunity for members outside the committee to appear before the committees will be granted uniformly. I think it's just a professional courtesy for our colleagues. I did want to offer you or request unanimous consent that Representative Barbara Lee's written comments be submitted for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton of the state of Arizona. We have few more minutes before votes are called, so to your chagrin, I will ask a few more questions, and then I'm going to give the same amount of time to the ranking member, Mr. Castro. So, you know, there is Mr. Jacobstein. The least thing that the Cuban regime or the Cuba regime wants is for Democrats and Republicans to work together to help the average Cuban person. So that's why, as I told you from the beginning of this hearing, that we are on the same page. We do want to help that average, insignificant Cuban that has no ties to the regime to have something like the board that I just presented. So I just want to make that really clear. You and I were on the same page. So my question to you is this: how can we help you? How can we help this administration to really help those small business owners in Cuba? I repeat, that have no contact or connections with the regime, in order to open up a good store if they want to, or to have their own privately owned business. What can we do together?
Thank you very much for that question. I would encourage you the next time that some of these private entrepreneurs come to Washington, come to Miami, to meet with some of these individuals, to talk to them, to hear about their experience and ways that we can support them.
And we will do that. But then what about if I can feed you 50 names of 50 people who are trying to have a small business, but they either have not been able to bribe the government official that needs to give them the license, or that they have a lot of impediments and hurdles to get to what the Guajiritos or the other La Antilla, which is the other bread station that I just mentioned.
I would be
If I were to give you names of people that want to be small business owners in Cuba, could you commit to help those and call Havana and have conversations with Havana that these people should be included on that list?
I'd be very happy. I'd be very happy to review any information you provide to us.
No, not just reading. I'm talking about helping those people that we're going to be feeding you, because now I'm going to make sure that through social media, I'm going to call everyone in Cuba that would like to become a business owner to go and apply.
Thank you. Our embassy continues to support the Cuban private sector. I'd be happy to review that list, share that with our embassy in Havana.
But it's not only review the list, it's working with us in my office to make sure that those people that have no contact with the Cuban government be able to obtain the licenses, because since the Biden administration is so interested in making that sector grow, which I am too, so then why don't we work together to make the sector grow, but not just certain individuals. But I do need your help. I need the help from the State Department and the United States Embassy in Havana. Could I have that?
I can't speak to a list I haven't seen, but in theory, we'd love to help individuals who want support
And do you commit to helping those people that we're going to provide you?
Like I said, I can't support to commit to help individuals on a list that I haven't seen, but we'd be happy to review and work with you.
Thank you. I yield back. Ranking member, if you would like to ask a few other questions.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, how have China's and Russia's economic, diplomatic, and military presence in Cuba changed over the last few years?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. I think it's important. You know, As I mentioned, our work in the private sector is really important as we continue to curb PRC influence. But we have seen that some of the PRC promises have not followed through. They've really not followed through on in a big way. So continue to be concerned about this and would love to work with you. The PRC serves as Cuba's second largest trading partner after Venezuela, but PRC investment in Cuba is limited. And one example I'd give you, a longstanding PRC-Cuba sugar trade agreement was suspended in 2023 when Cuba couldn't meet its 400,000 ton yearly agreed quota. So I think there's a lot of talk about cooperation, but we don't often see delivery from the PRC on these commitments.
And also, what's the role of the Cuban diaspora in the United States in supporting private sector businesses in Cuba? And how is the State Department engaged with the Cuban diaspora and Cuban Americans in determining these policy shifts?
Thank you, Congressman. We are consistently in touch with the Cuban diaspora and welcome opportunities to do that even more so. Former Congressman Joe Garcia, who I know is in the audience today, and a number of other individuals have worked closely with independent Cuban entrepreneurs. They brought them to Miami, to other parts of the United States to engage more deeply. So we are very much engaged on this and would love to do even more in this space.
Thank you. I yield back.
All right, thank you, Ranking Member. And so I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. And now, pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit new statements, questions, and other materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. And without objections, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you to both of you for your testimony.